So like a lot of you, I've been thinking about the Elder Scrolls 6, where it'll be set, what it'll be like, which companion I'll hate, the usual. And by the usual, I mean I have an embarrassingly long document that I've been adding stuff to for years, talking about every aspect of the game, even creating custom skill trees and battle systems. And I did all of this before I even considered having a YouTube channel. All of this to say, I'm really cool. Anyway, the resulting mess of ideas has enough content potential in it to fuel a lot of videos. So this is the start of a series of videos on my ideal Elder Scrolls 6. I will work on this whenever I run out of ideas for videos. I'd be grateful for any feedback or criticism you have to offer on this, so feel free to rate and comment. On that note, let's begin. This series, at least starting out, will focus purely on the game design, just the big idea, more general direction I take this next game in. It's important to state up front that I'm not going to try to make Elder Scrolls into something it isn't. I want my Elder Scrolls 6 to feel like it could be made by Bethesda. I do want a game with more depth than previous titles. I want a game that builds on the foundations that have already been built, but I'll do so while also adhering to the flexibility and accessibility that make Bethesda's games appealing for so many people. And the first stop in this video series is skills. Skills in Elder Scrolls work differently than in other games. In other RPGs, you gain experience points to level up your skills. In Elder Scrolls, you gain experience points by leveling up your skills, and you level up your skills by using them. Skyrim's leveling system is closer to a simulation of real life than most other RPGs. It's obviously not entirely realistic, but it makes a certain amount of sense that as you use a certain skill, you get better with it. This makes the game both easier to figure out on your own and more immersive. This, I feel, is a core part of the franchise. It makes the games both unique and accessible, but it's not perfect. And the core problem isn't how the skills work, but the skills themselves. For the most egregious example, let's look at the melee skills in the last 3 Elder Scrolls games. Morrowind had short blade, long blade, blunt, axe, spear, and hand-to-hand as their own skills. Oblivion combined the blades into one category, put axes under blunt, and removed spears. And Skyrim removed all of the weapon skills and replaced them with 2 different skills, one-handed and two-handed, to cover all one-handed and two-handed weapons. Each game has its own shortcomings. In Morrowind, everything was its own skill, and this allowed you to make more unique builds and allowed you to be recognized for playing a certain way, but it punished you for not sticking with that build. If you want to switch from swords to maces in Morrowind, you'd basically be starting from square one. Meanwhile, if you want to do the same thing in Skyrim, you can because both are under the same skill tree. This doesn't mean that Skyrim's alternative doesn't have problems of its own. Skyrim's system does allow for more flexibility and freedom, but it gets that freedom by generalizing everything. Part of the appeal of RPGs is navigating a world and its challenges with a particular set of skills, and Skyrim's leveling system is too generalized to really allow that. The lack of skills in Skyrim means that players who do stick with a particular playstyle aren't really rewarded or recognized for their effort. The short sword assassin and the heavy-bladed mace user both gain their damage from the same skill, one-handed. This removes a lot of character from your builds and makes multiple playthroughs feel really samey, especially with how linear the quests are. And as for why I didn't bring up Oblivion, Oblivion is the middle stepchild of the Elder Scrolls franchise and has a combination of the problems in Morrowind and Skyrim. My Elder Scrolls 6 would be a combination of the strengths of Morrowind and Skyrim while trying to fix their weaknesses. It'll be a sort of middle ground without compromising either. Let's keep using melee as an example. One-handed and two-handed would carry over from Skyrim, however blade, blunt, axes, and spears would be making a comeback as well. Hand-to-hand would factor under blunt unless you picked one of the beast races where it would factor under blade, since they would use their claws, which would be slashing or blade damage. We will also have hand-to-hand be its own fighting style as well, separate from one-handed or two-handed. The big takeaway from this is that we'll have both the fighting style categorization from Skyrim and the weapon style categorization system from Morrowind and Oblivion. We will categorize weapons with both the systems from Morrowind and the systems from Skyrim, which means that each weapon would be governed by 2 skills. A one-handed sword would be governed by one-handed and blade. A two-handed sword would be governed by two-handed and blade, and the one-handed mace would be governed by one-handed and blunt, and so on. Each weapon would also level up the skills that manage it. So using the one-handed sword would level up one-handed and blade, and the same for two-handed swords and one-handed maces. I would extend a similar system to other types of skills where it makes sense, but we'll get into that when we cover specific skills. The point of this example is that the amount of skills here allows for players to be recognized for their build choices, but it doesn't entirely lock you out of trying something new either, because as you use one weapon, you're increasing 2 skills, and each of those skills are half the equation for a few other weapons. Using one-handed swords increases both one-handed and blade, so if you decide you wanted to swap to a one-handed mace or two-handed blade, you will have already got some skill in it. It won't be at the level of your one-handed sword, but it won't be at square one either. I feel like this would be a great balance between recognizing players who stick with a playstyle and flexibility for players who want to experiment more or maybe don't know going in what kind of build they want to make. It would also recognize players that go for more hybrid builds, like if you wanted to dual wield with a sword and a mace, you'd be recognized for that because you'd be leveling up one-handed, blade, and blunt at about the same rate. Throughout the Elder Scrolls series, Bethesda has been removing more and more skills. I feel this is an attempt to either flesh out each skill individually, or, more likely, it's a way to try to appeal the game to a wider audience. It's a way to make the game more flexible by allowing you to use whatever weapon you want when you want to use it. And for a more avid player, this is a little disappointing, but I feel as though this system could really be the balance between Bethesda letting in new players and rewarding the more avid players for learning the systems. In fact, not only do I feel as though this could appeal to avid gamers better than Skyrim, I actually feel like it could appeal to avid gamers better than any previous Elder Scrolls title, because each of these skills would have their own perk trees. This gives the melee perk trees in particular a chance to shine. In Skyrim, the one-handed and two-handed perk trees needed to do a lot of heavy lifting. They needed to have skills that helped any one-handed or two-handed weapon, which meant catering both to those who dual-wielded and those that didn't. But they also needed skills specific to blade, axe, or blunt users to reward players who stuck with those weapons. It's a lot for one perk tree to handle, and I could see how fitting all of that into one tree would require compromising the amount of skills you would put in said tree. With this new system, however, one-handed and two-handed and hand-to-hand would have their own skill trees, and blade, blunt, axes, and spears would have their own skill trees. For example, let's focus on the one-handed and blade skill trees. The one-handed tree wouldn't have to have weapon-specific skills like blade skills or axe skills or blunt skills, and instead could focus on one-handed fighting as a whole. Maybe the 3 paths of the one-handed skill tree could be players who fight with a shield, players who dual wield, or players who don't use anything in their offhand at all. Maybe even a 4th one for players that use magic in their offhand. Each of these could get some meaningful perks to flesh out the playstyle of one-handed without neglecting weapon-specific perks like the blade skill. Similarly, the blade tree wouldn't have to worry about giving an equal amount of perks to one-handed blade users and two-handed blade users, which would likely end up just being copies of the same perk anyway, just applied to a different weapon. Instead, we could give blade its own unique perks that affects all blades, and it will be up to the player to mix and match them with other perk trees or weapon types that they're running. A blade perk could play very differently with a two-handed weapon as opposed to a one-handed weapon, and the player could choose what kind of blade perks to pick given their build, given the fighting style they increase in. In this way, perks from both the fighting style trees and the weapon type trees could mix and match in ways that allow for a lot more depth and player expression. Yet at the same time, each tree would be more focused and specific and probably smaller overall, making the trees themselves easier to follow and understand for newer players. But what types of perks would these trees consist of? And what other changes to the perk system do I have in mind? Well, that'll all be covered next time. Thanks for watching.